I'm Lois Donnelly, interviewing Professor Erica Burman on the 16th of December 2022 over Zoom. And we're discussing their life and career in the context of feminism and its history within psychology. So first of all then, would you like to tell me just a little bit about yourself? So in terms of the trajectory of your career and the kind of topics of your work.
Okay. So I grew up in Liverpool. I'm the child of sort of mixture of first and second generation immigrants to the UK who stopped off at Liverpool willingly or unwillingly. Of Jewish background, that'll figure in my sort of political activities. Well, I'm 62. I grew up in the 1960s. I benefited from I suppose, a kind of a girls' school system that was very acknowledging and supportive of academic achievements. And my family, my mother, in a single parent family, as well. That's important, with lots of strong women. In terms of my career, so I went to straight to university from school, and I studied developmental psychology with cognitive studies at Sussex University. So Sussex was the place that had specialized kinds of psychology. I knew I wanted to study, well, I arrived at wanting to study psychology really because I wasn't sure what I wanted. I didn't feel I wanted to specialize in a specific subject, and I had this naive assumption that psychology would sort of combine all my interests. And that developmental psychology would as well, because it wasn't that I was particularly interested in children, or it was more the philosophical and epistemological questions that attracted me to thinking about the origins and growth of knowledge. In that sense, I was in a perfect place because Piaget was all the rage, and that was his he wasn't really interested in children either. It was the philosophical questions. So I did my first degree in Sussex, and I was a very enthusiastic psychologist and social scientist. I wish actually that if I hadn't done the cognitive studies, I would have been in the School of Cultural and Community Studies, because they had schools as well as courses, and because I was doing cognitive studies, I was in social sciences. If I'd been in cultural and community studies, I'd have been able to sort of go to lectures, well, have courses with Jacqueline Rose and Gillian Rose and lots of really amazing people. But I mean, I was taught by very good, some very good tutors in cognitive studies and social sciences anyway. But then I finished my degree. One of my tutors suggested, and I think these moments are very important, actually, aren't they? She said, "Oh, you might want to think about taking a further degree or doing a PhD." And I thought, "Oh," and then she said, "We haven't got any money here, but you can always apply and get a place and see." And that led me to think about doing a PhD, which I hadn't. I think I applied for 2 or 3, and I got one in Manchester, which was a linked award. And I took that. So that was the first one I was offered. So I took it. And I've been in Manchester ever since. So I was a doctoral student at what was then called the Victoria University of Manchester. And it's now the University of Manchester. I had a kind of I wouldn't say it was a smooth trajectory as a doctoral student. I can tell you a lot about that if you want. I got, I still hadn't finished my doctorate. I got so I'm giving you the broad outline first. Is that okay? Yeah. I then got a teaching post, well, a post at what was then Manchester Polytechnic. And in 1986, so I graduated in 1981 from my first degree. I got a doctoral position immediately after. I suppose I ran out of money then in about 1984. I kind of found other ways to support myself and did other things, but still was nominally doing my PhD. And in 1986, I started working teaching developmental psychology in Manchester Polytechnic. Oh, well, developmental psychology, human development, child development, every course under the sun that you know, nursing, community work, art education, social work, as well as psychology, that had, you know, that because it was a period when there was a lot of, it was called service teaching, and that was very formative educational experience for me. And I worked there until well, I finished my doctorate while working at Manchester Polytechnic in 1990, which was very informed by my experience of teaching, really, as well as finding a way to think about the research that I had done in the light of the theories and approaches that were becoming much more available, and recognized, like discursive approaches, discourse analysis, post-structuralist, what you might call post-structuralist ideas, Foucault, Derrida, Lacan, etc. That all the ideas that the book Changing the Subject kind of brought centrally for a particular cohort and generation of psychology postgraduates. That was a key text. It's sort of encapsulated the ideas and the politically engaged approaches, and that we wanted to bring into our work. Yes, so in terms of my trajectory, I worked at Manchester Polytechnic, which became Manchester Metropolitan University, moving from being a lecturer to a professor. I named the chair Psychology and Women's Studies because by then I had moved from teaching psychology and developmental psychology to teaching. There was a nominal sort of psychology of sex differences module that we made the psychology of women. It was when all those things were beginning. And then with other colleagues across the university, we developed a master's in women's studies at that time that ran for about 10 years or so. And again, that was another very formative experience because we taught together as staff. And of course, it was very interdisciplinary. And I know the moment that I got the chair in 1998, I think it was, you know, it was when the term women was under a lot of challenge and moving towards gender studies and courses in gender studies, sexuality studies, etc. But I felt it was important to lay claim to something. I'm not sure I would, you know, I'm not saying I would do that now, but that was a sort of significant feminist claim on the specificity of gender positions and relations. So I think that feminist perspective, you know, became more and more prominent, and was also the sort of conceptual, analytical understandings and practical understandings were very much informed by teaching on that master's in women's studies for over 10 years, where I was teaching modules that were both sort of general on sort of feminist epistemologies and practices, but also sort of specific ones on feminisms and psychological practices, and also around feminist approaches to mental health, with other colleagues too. And then in 2013, I left MMU, again for significant reasons, but was able to get a position in Manchester University, where I am now, and in an institute of education, which is kind of interesting because I'd stopped feeling very much a psychologist, or perhaps I'm more of an anti-psychologist anyway, an anti-developmental psychologist, or a childhood studies theorist, because childhood studies has become, I mean, I've got on my desk here, I mean, because I just went into the department the other day and picked up 2 months worth of Post and whatever, and all these journals. There's theory in psychology, there's feminism and lots of feminisms in psychology, and there's sort of childhood studies journals, and I suppose seeing them on my desk here, well, it's quite in that I need to look through them, quite indicative really of the sort of the multiple positions I feel I occupy. There are lots of psychologists in education, and paradoxically I'm now teaching on a counseling psychology program, because in the mid 1990s, and again it's part of a sort of intellectual and political trajectory that's common to people of, I think, my cohort, and maybe some feminists, and also some earlier who get interested in psychoanalytic theory as a resource, and then think, oh well, how does it work in practice? But I trained as a group analyst, and although my head of department, bless him, Peter Bannister, kind of said to me, oh, when I said, could I have some support to this training, you said, no, what relevance does it have to what you do? Actually, I started teaching on the counseling courses that we were running at MMU, and it's the main bulk of my teaching, and just sort of supporting as a mental health practitioner, because I'm UKCP registered through the Institute of Group Analysis. Most of my actual day-to-day work is supporting this kind of mental health related work, although most of my research interests have been around well, now I'm calling it something that I've named child as method, of the way in which the construct of children and childhood kind of organizes and mobilizes and reflects and actively contributes to a range of other interpersonal and geopolitical relations and dynamics. So that's a kind of quick trajectory. Is there anything you want to follow up from that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd definitely like to go back to, as you were saying, kind of maybe that not so smooth PhD journey. That sounds really interesting. Yeah, do you want to tell me a bit more about that?
Yes, well, so the award I got was the doctoral scholarship. It was the precursor of the ESRC was the SSRC, Social Science Research Council, and it was a new thing called a linked award. So the candidate was joining a project that the academic supervisory team had devised, and rather than bringing their own ideas. And this was on, can you believe it, microprocessors in education. But the people who were running it were sort of actually either computer people or rat behaviorists, and they weren't remotely interested in either children or education. So I worked as a research assistant. I did work in schools. I sort of and at the same time, at that time, funded doctoral students had to go to conferences, some kind of ESRC postgraduate conferences, and at that the first or second of those, some of us constellated together, and I can tell you who those people are, and you've probably interviewed some of them. And we sort of over a period of time formed a sort of, well, it was very, very cheesy name, Circle of Sympathy, but it was a sort of network of support that was sort of intellectual and personal support. And that was very, very important. In fact, in a way, I mean, the man I live with, I met through that network, Ian Parker. I mean, and he's written his own kind of intellectual and political biography, and I found some programs for those conferences, and that's not specifically feminist, but there were quite a few feminists as part of that, and that would include Corinne Squire, who I hope you've interviewed.
Not this chunk, unfortunately, but
okay. I'm trying to think. But there were people who have left psychology, and I think this is something I wanted to bring into this interview. I've always been interested in, feminist psychology is now so institutionalized in a way, and it's been a wonderful thing to see that happen. And I and lots of other people who are now professors, have certainly benefited from that tremendously. We've struggled, but we've been, successful in lots of ways. But one of the things I was very committed to when the first book I published was called Feminists and Psychological Practice,
right.
Which I edited. And I was really committed to having accounts of leaving psychology there. And so I managed to get two people, Sue Sharp and Jane Jefferson, wrote sort of their own accounts of why they left psychology. And it was very significant in terms of gender and feminist commitments and what psychology didn't do for them and what didn't offer them in different ways. So I benefited from having some of those other kinds of supports that helped us and deal with the alienation. But Poddy Pearman, who was part of that circle of sympathy, left a long time ago, and she became a youth and community worker, and she's around Manchester somewhere. Feminist activist, certainly. And there was another woman I met at some conference called Diana Clark, who was one of Cathy Irwin's students, and she left to become she got active in the women and manual trades movement that was very big at the time, as part of women taking charge, being physically active, doing things for themselves, not just self-defense but skills.
Yes.
And she became a joiner.
Oh,
so
wow.
Yeah, so people go in lots of, and her work was really, really interesting. So the ones who kind of stay, I mean, sometimes, there are lots of jokes, aren't there, in universities about people getting promotion through incompetence, but, especially in sort of some managerial positions or administrative ones, sometimes I think, well, maybe those of us who sort of stayed, it's not that we've been the really successful ones, it's just the ones who were left, who managed to be, who had the sort of support to be able to weather it, really. And it is possible to see in individual people's trajectories just how they have struggled and how institutional contexts have been very constraining. And I think I was really lucky that I got a job in a sort of marginal educational institution that had some, at the time, Manchester Polytechnic was, it couldn't award its own degrees. I was a Manchester City Council employee. There were equal opportunities policies coming in around policies for, I mean, it's incredible to think about this now, policies for mature students, women students, Black students, disabled students, trying to encourage participation in higher education. So there was it wasn't welcomed by many of my colleagues in the psychology department, and often got designated part of the feminist thought police around sort of being active in formulating equal opportunities, sort of policy practice documents, etc. But we I was lucky to have some supportive colleagues and supportive senior colleagues, as well as this sort of national network. Then, over time became very much an international network. And I think those things are, and that then fed into the specifically feminist networks, but wasn't exclusively So in yeah, so the the job at in terms of my own sort of doctoral student trajectory, yes, I did that first year of and I discovered that really the kind of theoretical, conceptual, methodological conversations I wanted to have with my supervisor, just met a bit of a blank. And I don't know, should I name people?
Yeah, if you want to, and we can always kind of take them out later, or it's totally up to you.
Right. Well, my primary supervisor was Graham Hitch, who worked with Alan Baddeley in developing the sort of sketch theory of memory, something like that. Anyway, you know, like worlds apart from my interests, because although I'd become a signed up enthusiastic psychologist in my first degree, for reasons we'll probably come on to, I did kind of finish it with a degree of disenchantment and acquiring sort of critical perspectives. You know, I knew that I mean, I might have wanted to do something on sort of, well, I mean, I arrived at a project on children's concepts of age, because in Piaget's work, that's a much more social concept than time specifically, but obviously it interacts. And I was fascinated by all, you know, discussions about time anyway. And I thought it was a way of getting into discussions about power and what would now be called generational orders, but the term didn't exist yet. And certainly to do something qualitative. Yeah, Graham, I mean, bless him, he was also director of postgraduate studies, and there was I've told the story before, but there was a meeting. I was supposed to, as every student was, present something about my proposed research at some point in these postgraduate seminars, which, you know, were very badly attended. And at the one around the Easter break, it was just me and him. And I sort of talked to him about what I was interested in. And and he just sort of said, well, I mean, I respect the fact that he acknowledged that he had no idea about this. It wasn't his area, and he suggested that I found another supervisor, and he even suggested who that might be. And because by that point I was thinking, this is not for me, I'm really going to drop out, you know. And the dropout rate for doctoral students, especially full-time ones, was and probably still is extremely high. And lots of people around me were sort of just giving up. So I did follow up his suggestion, which was John Churcher, who was at that time acquiring and developing his interest in psychoanalysis, and he did indeed become a psychoanalyst, a Kleinian psychoanalyst, and he actually lives in this road, but I don't see a lot of him.
Really?
And he was a very facilitative supervisor, in the sense that he was you know, not prescribing what I should do, and certainly encouraging me to read widely. But he is someone who hasn't actually finished his own PhDs, and he has started several, and he was not helpful in enabling me to finish it, I should say.
Right.
And I think I've learned a huge amount from the whole process, you know, the whole existential sort of dilemmas, anxieties that I think one inevitably faces in doing a doctorate, and the privilege of that position, and the the subordinate status. I mean, we also became quite active as postgraduates around the sort of failure to recognize our labor. In doing a lot of teaching, although the teaching I did was very rewarding, and some of those students I've encountered much later on, as you know, who remember the seminars I did with them in their first. Really sweet, really sweet. Yeah, and it was, of course, very useful for me in my future teaching. But where I am now in the Institute of Education at Manchester University, there's a whole kind of apparatus of graduate teaching assistants and senior tutors, and and they're very politically mobilized because they're part of the precariat, precarious casual workers, disposable labor. But we were developing that consciousness as postgraduate students too, but I was part of as a postgraduate, I also formed a women in research group.
Oh.
In Manchester University with Liz Bondy, who's a feminist geographer. She was doing her PhD. Well, I advertised in, I don't know, yeah, I think I might have put the ad in the university newsletter thing, and 3 women responded, and it was just at the time that Liz Stanley and Sue Wise had published that book, doing feminist research or feminist, and it was a sort of, it became a bit of a Bible for us, I suppose. So it was a very useful thing to identify with and use and discuss. And we ran that kind of, we did women in research group for quite 2 or 3 years, I think. Although one of the interesting things we encountered, so it was for women, those identified as women and who were researchers, I think across the university. I can't remember quite what range of disciplines, and in the end, we could feel that people were, the women participants were getting a bit protective and about their research and didn't want to talk about it, which is a bit of a shame. But it was certainly a sort of very formative and consciousness raising activity for me, intellectually, and I remain good friends with Liz Bondy. The other major person involved, she emigrated, or I can't remember if she was originally from Canada. Anyway, she went back to Canada or went to Canada. So we lost contact. So this is all, a long time ago, in the early 1980s. But so finishing the PhD, when I started the job at Manchester Polytechnic, I had the material generated. I had done interviews in schools. I had tried to find a way of analyzing the material. At that point, discourse analysis, well, what the term discourse analysis meant was something, it was a book by Brown and Newell in linguistics called Discourse Analysis. There were debates in semantics and pragmatics. I was sort of trying to invent, and there were these debates coming in, Foucault, Lacan, Derrida, about language, etc. And I had got stuck in the analysis, just trying to find ways of analysing material. And it was only some years later, and with the support of other colleagues in Manchester Polytechnic, and I would say particularly in Parker, that, and the fact, the institutional pressure, because I had a 2-year temporary job. I had a 2-year temporary job because it was a political moment when Manchester Polytechnic was, these institutions used to be quite generous or have an idea about staff development. And the woman I replaced, who had been teaching all the developmental psychology, was paid to be seconded to train as a counsellor as part of her professional development. So that was a 2-year course, and I came in to replace her. And in the end, she actually decided not to come back, and she returned to the institution and became part of the counselling service, and indeed headed it for quite a long time. So I was on a 2-year post, and I had friends, including Jane Jefferson, who's one of the people who wrote in Feminist and Psychological Practice, who she job shared another 1-year temporary post. And because another member of staff, Carolyn Kagan, who you might know as a feminist community social psychologist, who's a very powerful figure and charismatic in her own way, she went off to train as a social worker. So there was those, and then after 2 years, but it was only for Jane and people like her, these temporary posts required such an investment of time and effort, and it was very particularly teaching on all these in-service, all these professional courses and the nursing courses, some of them, that we encountered a lot of sexism from mature older male students. Found it very difficult being taught by young experienced women. I'm sure we weren't very good. We really weren't very good teachers either. Some of us. Well, I wasn't at the beginning, certainly.
Yeah.
And
do you think of any, like, are there any particular examples of that come to mind as you're thinking?
I mean, I know that because we were also teaching on 4 campuses. And I remember putting up in our joint meeting room, sort of staff cubbyhole, really, a little piece of paper on the wall with sexist sayings of the day that we would kind of.
Oh, wow.
I can't remember specific ones. No.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah. And it, you know, there were some lovely students, but it would particularly, you know, it was a moment when I think there was pressure for nurses to get higher, you know, to get degrees, and they were quite resentful for being there and quite resentful to be taught things that they thought they already knew. And a lot of what we had to teach, we really weren't in control of. There was a set curriculum for the nurses, and it probably was really inappropriate and telling them what they already knew in quite a patronizing way. So yeah, so you could understand their resistance.
Yes.
But it wasn't pleasant to be on the receiving end. Yeah, so what and I've lost the thread a bit. What was I saying? Oh yes, finishing my doctorate. So I mean, you know, it wasn't for those people on shorter term temporary contracts, really, it wasn't an attractive prospect to stay in the university, and you could well understand why they left. And somehow for me, the fact that it was 2 years rather than 1, and I had the opportunity to kind of see some return on the investment of that terribly, I was so anxious most of the first year, to, you know, one step ahead of the, you know, the students every lecture, because I had a massive teaching load,
right,
and unbelievable compared to, you know, I mean, the polys really did work staff hard, but the condition, so a permanent job was then advertised, and the condition of that was doing a doctorate, and that it was really that although, you know, I was surrounded by other colleagues who made the same promise and didn't deliver, but I did, and it was the fact that I had to get it that made me return to that work. And by that stage, those theories, the debates were kind of had moved that little step further on, that I could understand that the problems that I had been grappling with personally were not only mine, and they were not only personal, but they were sort of analytical, conceptual, you know, genuine conundrums, and were things that needed to be topicalized in their own right. And so and Valerie Walkerdine was my external examiner, and by that stage I practically got the proofs of my book. I think anyway, she'd signed up my book as part of the critical psychology series, deconstructing developmental psychology, which was sort of based on my thesis and also my teaching. But the experience of teaching, I mean, partly sort of just getting real and doing something and having to make things sort of a little bit more accessible than going off in my head somewhere. I mean, that was very, very helpful for finishing the writing. I mean, I worked very hard, as you do. I mean, to finish a doctorate and do huge amounts of teaching, I mean, you never really recover from doing, you know, you become a workaholic by sort of habit then, don't you? So in a way, I mean, I kind of learned a lot from the supervisory hiccups, and one of the things I suppose I've done a lot of now, I've probably supervised nearly 100 doctorates now, you know, is sort of kind of know quite a lot about that process.
Yeah, that's really useful, I'm sure, for your students as well. So I suppose, you know, we've been talking a lot about feminism and kind of women's studies and those kinds of groups that are networks that you kind of built up. I'm just wondering kind of at what stage did your feminist identity kind of develop, and when did that really get into your work?
Yeah, good question. So, so as I said, I grew up in a single parent family.
Mm-hmm.
My father died very, very, very young. And I would say I was sort of brought up by my mum, my grandmother, and other women, including someone who was a sort of, I think she'd been a nanny to my grandmother had 6 children in 8 years. And I guess that my grandparents made a kind of class transition from being, because my they were the original migrant story was, sort of door to door selling, and when eventually they got shops, they got houses, and they made a class transition, I suppose, sometime in my mum's childhood, were able to employ some help, so the third figure in my life was an Irish Catholic woman, who I just found out recently from my aunt, who's now about to be 91, that my grandmother had, when my father died, invited her to return and live with my mum, because when my father died, and I'm the youngest of 3 children. Mm. And I was, not yet born. So that kind of being surrounded by, I mean, I've written about it sort of as for myself, sort of a lot of absent men. There were no father, no grandfathers. Actually, just one grandmother. Mm-hmm. Lots of women who sort of. I mean, my mother felt the stigma of being a single mother very acutely, and I think she did encounter a lot of prejudice, and misogyny and sexism in lots of ways. But she was also very determined and very strong. My mother died earlier this year, so I've done quite a lot of thinking about all this sort of thing, but it's very much part of my childhood. So gender really wasn't much of an issue, except, I mean, I suppose I can tell the story of when I was sent, but being Jewish was was like the central, I suppose, positioning and identity. I was sent to a Jewish kindergarten, and there is a kind of, I have a memory of getting very upset because a boy, the teacher gave the boys a kippah to wear, and I said I wanted to wear one, and she said no, because you're a girl. And the story that I was able to corroborate around this some time ago is that they got a phone call saying I was screaming and had to come and collect me, and I never went back. I went to school early, actually. I mean, I was desperate to go to school because my older sister and brother were going to school. It seemed really interesting. So I actually went to school a term early. Oh, wow. So I don't know whether that gender, that's a kind of very liberal equality kind of issue. But clearly it mattered. And in Orthodox Jewish practice, there is great difference in being a girl and a boy. I went to Hebrew classes 3 times a week. The prizes that the boys and girls got were very different qualities. The watch that you got was very different, the boy and the girl. You felt you'd, on the other hand, have had a great time in synagogue on Saturdays chatting with my friends, because there's no part to play overtly, collectively in the service. So there's sort of paradoxes there. I went to a non-Jewish school, girls' school. I would say it was a good school, but it was very meritocratic. Mm-hmm. And I was one of a few Jewish girls in that school. So it was a very primary identity. I felt, my mother told me I was an ambassador for my people. all this sort of thing. So, I mean, it's actually, I think in many ways, the dynamics are very similar to being a young Asian woman, you know, sometime later, perhaps. You know, it means it's very much part of my own anti-racist feminist identifications and practices that, you know, I think I do share some aspects of both. I mean, I have encountered quite both implicit and quite direct anti-Semitism, including you know, having a brick through my window from the National Front. So yeah, but when I went to university, to Sussex, it was a very I mean, I think actually I didn't realize that it was supposed to be a very left-wing and radical place, because I wasn't very politicized. Right. I think I joined the Jewish Socialist Group. It had a little, and that's an important network, and it remains. But I'd sort of become aware of it. There's a whole other story about my gendered identity from belonging to the sort of youth groups available to me within the Jewish community. Mm-hmm. And I've written about this quite recently in a book on post-socialist childhoods, where I was sort of, because I've been in part of a really interesting project on post-socialist childhoods, and I've been involved, but I wrote something about being on the other side of the Iron Curtain. You know, how did the Cold War kind of impact on my childhood? And the only thing I could think about was the Save Soviet Jewry campaign of the 1970s, and my involvement, and that brought up a lot of issues about my involvement in different youth groups in the community. Which there was a religious one, which I hated because it was very gendered, and the girls, you know, very sort of confining for girls and young women. And the group that I then became very enthusiastic about was the Zionist youth group. Because it was like scouts, and, you know, it was all active and sort of, I mean, and probably that's one of the places where I encountered some socialist ideas and some, broadly speaking, well, gender equality ideas. Now my political trajectory has changed a great deal since that time, as have many of the people who I think were around those groups at that time. But I think it's important to acknowledge that those kinds of organizations, I mean, I think a lot of US Jewish feminists have written about this as well, that these were very enabling spaces in what could actually be quite a confined community for young women. So I went to university very much as a sort of self-identified Jew, not particularly religious, but I suppose, you know, connected with that kind of community, cultural, political identity, and that remains. Mm-hmm. I'm a secular but identifying Jew, in that, and I encountered actually there was Linda Bellos, who was around in as mobilizing as a feminist in Sussex, I think in social sciences, and she's a Black woman who has Jewish heritage, and she formed, I think her father's Jewish, formed a Jewish, I think a small Jewish feminist network, and I joined that. So that was very interesting. I think it was before she became lesbian, but, you know, there was a lot of debates going on. It was and so my route into feminism came as as someone who was Jewish, and that you know, from an already culturally, politically situated positioning. And it meant that also I felt quite alien from a lot of the debates that were happening at the time in the feminist scene around the maternalist turn, the cultural turn, all of that. And I suppose I came in that sort of later strand through what might be called identity politics and single issue campaigns and so on. So that was quite specific route. It's a strand of that, you know, I did join. There was a brief few years where there were national Jewish feminist conferences alongside the end of the women's liberation movement conferences, I think they finished, you know, probably in the 70s, before my time. And there were, as well as sort of other Jewish socialist and radical Jewish cultural sort of national events. So I was so I kind of that was a sort of specific route and positioning that helped me make the links. I think, you know, I felt as a young woman, you know, to identify as feminist, actually, I think I'll just have a,
yes, of course, take
yeah, and I think this is probably quite recognizable to sort of these days too. I don't think I really recognize myself as being oppressed. And sort of the position of victimhood or whatever. That to arrive at a feminist identification actually felt like giving up something. I mean, you know, I had a middle class privileged background, you know, with white privilege and class privilege, and from materially secure, and I think I was, you know, so individualism had been my sort of my place, and to affiliate in a more collective way meant both recognizing my privilege, but also giving up something of that defense. So I think a lot of young people start off being, you know, it's their place of relative freedom or autonomy just to claim, you know, in an individualist position. Anyway, that's what happened to me. And I, you know, I think I started to be much more politically aware. I mean, growing up in the household and family that I had, it was very much, I think it was very much a sort of hiding away from political debate. It took me a very long time to discover that my father had been in the Communist Party, for instance. You know, and I think there was a real sense of sort of hiding and trying, and it being good immigrant citizens and not making trouble, which is part of the sort of Anglo-Jewish community positioning, particularly in a marginal community that felt itself to be dwindling and in crisis, as the, you know, it wasn't like one of the very thriving ones in Manchester or London.
Yeah.
So, and the shadow of the Holocaust and etc. Yes, so I didn't have a sort of much kind of political awareness at all about, you know, or exposure to sort of any, you know, socialist or feminist ideas, really. I mean, I would say my mother was sort of would have benefited from and she, you know, she certainly engaged with my ideas. So when I was able to sort of talk with her about them. So
it happened more at university, I suppose.
It happened at university, and I mean, I did, you know, I did have some, I would say I was probably quite distressed as a young person, as a young woman. It was certainly gendered. And so, I mean, I did do a lot of reading, and I did read, I think it was, I don't know whether it's no, maybe as it was a postgraduate, I read things like Our Bodies, Ourselves, and texts and around health and bodies and all of that. But also a key issue for me was that in my final year, I was sexually harassed by another student.
Right.
Who it was it was a very innocent relationship. There was it wasn't a sexual relationship, but this guy was obviously also, I mean, I think there was a connection from our sort of historical distress that I don't know, made him tune into me. But anyway, it got extremely nasty, to the extent that I had to leave the university I mean, it involved bringing in the police on discussions with the police, and I have to say the police, in Brighton, were kind of having conversations like, because I was getting really threatening letters. I was affected. I don't think the word stalking kind of existed, but but it certainly would have been that, and it was interpreting whether a sort of violent language, this kind of formulation constituted a threat to life or not. The most bizarre sort of conversations to have with not very sympathetic police, or perplexed. It was interesting seeing the university response, because they just said, "Oh, we've never had, this has never happened before," because eventually I was sharing a house with someone else on my course, and her partner, and someone else on another course, and they said, "You must tell, that they were getting terrorized as well."
Right.
And actually, and I mean, I think one of your questions is about sort of mentors and things, but I went and told my personal tutor, Julie Rutkowska, who is a cognitive scientist, and she became a professor and everything. And it is to her utter, credit, and I'll always be grateful. She just believed me.
Yeah.
And not only did she believe me, but when because the police and the university, who managed to talk to each other, they advised sending me away while this guy was kind of being told off, and they were worried it would all escalate.
Yeah.
And I did go and stay with my sister in London for a bit, I think. And then I came back, and Julie was going on sabbatical, and I looked and offered for me to look after her house and her two gorgeous cats. So the last months of my undergraduate degree were sort of in this lovely house in Brighton, looking after the cats. And I'll always, and it was, when I think about it, it's just such an incredible thing to do, to offer. I mean, I've just had former doctoral students and academic colleagues staying in my house while I've been away, on and off. But for an undergraduate student to do that, I mean, to materially support, as well as academically, in institutionally, it was extraordinarily important, and I don't think I've ever told her how important it was. But we did remain in contact, and she did write me references too for my job. So. Wow. Yeah, and I should say I did. I mean, in terms, so I mean, as I've said, I'm someone who came from very unpolitical kind of, or depoliticized kind of background. So the politicization, in a way, had to come through the study. That was a legitimate arena for me to, and I think I probably read the word, first read about Marx in something on Piaget. Can you believe it? There was, and Julie Rutkowska and Stephanie Thornton, who were the tutors in social sciences, they ran a course called The Biological and Psychological Bases of Sex Differences or something. And, so that was a way into some of those discussions.
Yes.
Which was important. And also as a doctoral student, I followed with, I shared an office with someone who was doing an MSc in child development. And there weren't many students, so I sat in on lots of those courses. And one of the people teaching was a woman called Elena Leven, who is a feminist developmental psycholinguist, a very important one. But she ran a course, what was it called? Something on sexualities, that was also tremendously valuable for me, and both, personally, and then subsequently for all my teaching.
Yes.
So those kind of the intellectual experiences and exposure, the personal ones. I mean, I think, it took a long time to process what had happened in my final year, and understand it as not something wrong with me, etc. But as a, but it certainly retrospectively, I realized, it made me feminist.
Yeah.
It made me realize I had common cause with other women.
Yes. That's so interesting, isn't it? That kind of that definitely, that personal kind of feeding into that. Okay, well, great. So shall we perhaps move on to kind of talking about your work more specifically? So I was thinking whether you have kind of any particular piece of work or accomplishment that you're most proud of.
Oh, it's just really difficult because, you know, these things move as you know, go through, you know, what it's and mostly one is most interested in the thing after the thing you're currently doing, the thing you're doing next, you know, in terms of the structure of desire. Um, so I mean, I'm proud. I'm most. What was the question? What I'm most proud of, or
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, lots of different things in different ways. Because I mean, that book, Feminist and Psychological Practice, that I didn't even write a chapter in. I mean, it was a wonderful, and Sue put it into the Feminism and Psychology series. It was it, you know, I got loads of letters from women saying, "Oh, it's so wonderful to see this. It's really helped me." Yeah, it was, and we had some events, you know, around it. So that was, you know, that was really great. The book Deconstructing Developmental Psychology has been a bit of a kind of surprise bestseller, and I kind of remain perplexed. They've just asked me if I'll do a fourth edition.
Gosh.
Oh, a couple of, and I kind of, and I feel a bit well, and I shouldn't sort of take for granted sort of the. I'm deeply grateful that, you know, in a way I was lucky that it did something that we all knew was important, and I'm grateful that it's being used. But I don't think it's actually now my best work at all.
Okay.
You know, it did, but I think it was important, and I suppose it's what I'm most known for. I mean, actually, the work in my book Developments is more sort of, I think it's more interesting in lots of ways. I mean, partly because, you know, I don't see my, I mean, sometimes I'm a member of the developmental psychology section of the BPS, but I don't, you know, I don't think people would see me as a developmental psychologist. Sometimes I claim that label, but I'm certainly more of a feminist anti-developmental psychologist, an anti-psychologist. But sometimes it's important to claim the identity of psychology, isn't it? And
Yes, absolutely.
so, for strategic reasons, as part of that feminist sort of friction in and out of the discipline that I think is so important. But actually, I mean, I would say that some of the sort of collective or joint work I'm most proud of. I mean, it was sort of as a personal achievement. I mean, we wrote two books in the late 1990s, Challenging Women, Psychology's Exclusion, Feminist Possibilities, and another book, Psychology, Discourse, Practice. It was with some of the same feminist authors, but with some men as well. And, you know, they were really, really important experiences in co-authorship, in co-editorship, in mutual commentary. And then a series of research projects that were around the theme of domestic violence and minoritization. I think, you know, they over from the early 2000s that bring together ideas of interpersonal violence and sort of systemic and structural violence of immigration control, as well as the sort of institutional racism and systems, and were very important for me. So I think politically it was what an expression. I mean, all my intellectual work, or my academic work and research has always tried to straddle a sort of have an activist angle or intervention, but that's probably among the most. Although my mum used to say, "Oh, when is it going to? When are they going to do? You know, when is it all going to change as a result of this piece of research?" And so I don't know, but at least we were documenting good practice and bad practice and barriers, and creating new kind of analyses of to think about that intersection between race, class, gender, and sort of citizenship or lack of.
Yes.
and benefiting from particularly the kind of work that was coming out from Southall Black Sisters and Women Against Fundamentalism, which, you know, all of that work remains incredibly important. And the sort of networks, and I mean, the colleagues that you know, some of the colleagues that I work with on those projects, I mean, Khatija Chantler is now doing amazing work around domestic homicides and you know, all kinds of things that have attracted a lot of media attention. And I think is managing to make the kind of interventions that I was always very skeptical about policy, actually, and trying to change policy. I was educated by her, so I'm kind of quite proud of some of that work. I think it, you know, in terms of being valuable, that in terms of my my own kind of intellectual contribution, I suppose the book I wrote on Fanon and Childer's method I feel is the most sort of pushed me the most, and is the most you know, sort of rigorous and coherent and stretched, and yeah, I think it's an interesting, though actually almost completely unreviewed in psychology and education contribution.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I would say that it's really the sort of so much joint work in a way that, and I think it's important to try and make that more visible.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so I suppose, you know, throughout your work, but I suppose particularly in kind of the deconstructing developmental psychology and the more recent book around kind of Fanon and stuff, how do you kind of integrate your feminist values into those? You know, how does that work?
Well, although deconstructing developmental psychology, I mean, it used the deconstruction term, but I mean, and in its subsequent editions, it became a bit more deconstructionist, but it was touch and go what we were going to call it, actually. And it's certainly not a Derridian deconstruction kind of thing. It was and is a feminist critique of developmental psychology, and I think that's what it needed to be and what it remains, and it was built from my teaching as well as my research, but principally from my teaching of you know, with around children and childhood, and with especially with the mature students, and especially the women health professionals who kind of, I think I've written about this in the introduction to the books now or something, but you know, they showed me this, you know, it became manifest what those practices do, particularly to women, and you know, but to sort of subjugated groups, racialized groups, working class, you know, there's the whole normalization, stigmatization, pathologization that is encapsulated in everything to do with children and childhood. And I think that's why I think I'm finding childhood studies are kind of, although it has its own problems and isn't always feminist, and some areas of education studies sort of they're more receptive to these arguments than psychology ever has. Attachment to normative development is very strong, I think, in psychology, and very difficult to well, I mean, I think it's probably impossible to dismantle, but it's more about seeing what the attachment is, and when one can try and destabilize it enough to allow other perspectives in. So the Fanon work, I mean, ostensibly doesn't look very feminist. Fanon wasn't feminist, and there's a lot of misogyny and homophobia in some of his writing, but there are, you know, major feminist engagements with his work, and I think it's you know, and Sylvia Wynter's work is now a kind of like seen to be a sort of feminist recuperation of of Fanon's work, and her ideas are gaining a lot of traction. But I suppose for me that brought together some of the central interests that I had about the relationship between personal and political change, which is a feminist concern as well, and that kind of that understanding of emotions and learning. And change that comes through in sort of both education and sort of psychotherapy. So I mean, I see it as a feminist engagement with Fanon, but it's not just overtly feminist text. But I mean, the current work that I'm doing is, it sort of, which is taking up the child as method kind of perspective, is certainly informed by, because I think, feminist debates have changed such a lot, and I think they're much more integrated and engaged with post-colonial studies, with sexuality and queer studies, and it's really not possible to sort of, and all desirable, I think, to sort of say it is one, this is feminist and nothing else kind of thing, for very, important political reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's almost kind of key in the way that you engage with everything.
Yes. I mean, certainly I left the Jewish Socialist group because I thought, because of their gender politics of relating. I left the Labour Party because, well, I mean, that's just an awful place, but sadly, very sad. But I'm not involved in sort of I'm more involved in sort of or support a little bit, not enough, some campaigns and issues. But the sort of whole crisis around what is, the category woman and its exclusions is very, very, not before time. I mean, I already felt that in my own trajectory, that feminism didn't speak to me as a Jewish young woman, with its sort of very generalist, homogenized concerns, and as someone who identified as from a minoritized background, albeit with many privileges. So I think I try. I mean, and now I supervise a lot of work around gender and sexuality studies. I have done. I remain doing that, though it doesn't appear to have many institutional outlets these days. Certainly not. I mean, there is elsewhere in my university, and there's a lot of sexuality studies, but it's I'm a bit out of touch with what's happening in psychology, really, in there.
Yeah, that's interesting. I suppose as well, you've done a lot of work around kind of creative use of methodologies as well. And can you maybe tell me a bit about how that's developed over the years?
Oh, well, sure. Well, as I said, when I was doing my doctorate, I had to kind of create the analytical approaches from the debates and tools that were happening, and again that was informed by the circle of sympathy network and other and then I suppose Ian Parker and we formed the discourse unit in 1990 at Manchester Polytechnic as a place to support students doing qualitative, at that point undergraduate students doing qualitative work, because they were getting attacked by other colleagues as not proper research, etc. It kind of grew from then, but we always had a broad understanding of discourse, and that remains with me. We had lots of discussions and relationships with the other discourse groups that was sort of eventually formed, Loughborough and elsewhere. And now it's we've had lots of students who've and including international students who've gone to lots of places. So it's really very much an international network. I mean, there was a significant moment, I think this, various of us have written about this, where discursive approaches or discourse analysis really was the feminist approach to research.
Yes.
They were completely identified together. And there was I think when was it, 1990 or something, a day conference organized on feminism and discourse, that part of which I think Sue drew upon to do that book, Sue Wilkinson. So, I mean, I think it was a bit of a shock to some of us that some discursive work didn't appear to be very feminist, to be honest. But I still think it, it's a form of critique. And, if you're critiquing, or questioning the dominant order, then it's feministic, and lots of other things as well that, might be anti-racist and
yes,
etc. A class analysis. So that's what drew me. I needed the tools to do the critical work, to question the prevailing social arrangements, and discourse. I mean, qualitative research was sort of beginning and feminist methodologies and feminist research in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Came into psychology a bit later. Some of us seized it and brought it in. And for a while, discourse sort of got a bit sort of reified, I think, in psychology, as although there are many what's called discourse analysis or what was called discourse analysis in psychology, is it was just sort of bog standard close reading in humanities. It's the typical psychological fetish around the method. Yes. To sort of have to systematize and etc. So I have quite a flexible approach to discourse analysis, or even around the terminology, as you can see. And for me, it depends on what questions people are asking, who they what they're interested in, what the text is they're analyzing, and I don't exclusively supervise or even do myself sort of discursive work, but I suppose it was part of my it was certainly an important strand of my work historically, and part of what I've written about as a methodologist, as along with feminist research and a little bit around sort of the participatory, or some of the debates around participatory work, etc., and interviewing. Even the very early days of thematic analysis, I wrote in this book that Peter Bannister put together, which we wrote, the qualitative methods in psychology, which I think because Peter was the head of department, and he was big in the BPS even before he and also in the Open University. So it became an Open University set book, this book, Qualitative Research in Psychology. And I wrote the chapter on interviewing and on feminist research. I've looked back on it, but and the interviewing, the bit on analysis is just attached to the, stuff about interviewing dynamics. But I do have a statement about what thematic analysis is and how you do it. A section on how you do it and an example.
Oh, good.
So we had to be methodologists,
yes,
as well as theorists, because we had to, partly because of what psychology is, as a sort of a training in methods, and also to help people do the work we wanted them to do. So it was a sort of accident, but yes, it became a major part of my work.
Part and parcel, I suppose. Okay. Well, if we'll go on now then to talking a bit more about POWES, if that's okay. So if you could just tell me a little bit maybe about your involvement with the Psychology of Women Inequalities section of EPS.
Well, I can't give you, dates, absolute sort of I mean, and these histories are often very contested, I know, and highly charged, but, you know, I haven't checked my documents. So I'm going to give you general impressions of how I remember them, you know, as someone who is actually thinks a lot and writes quite a lot about memorial accounts. You know, I suppose it's the only way I can do it.
Yes.
But my sense is, in remembering it, thinking about it, is that I was, you know, at some, maybe one of these postgraduate conferences or something, came across Jan Burns and a few other people, and we decided to form an organization called Alliance of Women in Psychology. It was a lot of, out of which POWES came. So there was, and for a while there were parallel organizations too. So the idea was that, you know, feminists, and you know, it was the days when there were some women's therapy centers. Most, I think they've all closed now, sadly. There were and there was, you know, a lot of feminist activism going on elsewhere, and feminists in sociology were organizing. They had a caucus, and, you know, other disciplines. So the kind of whole women's liberation feminist movements were sort of, people were bringing them into and to try and challenge and transform key disciplines that are very central to maintaining gender depressions, actually, like psychology. So, I mean, I think we had some national get-togethers, regional, national. And the thing with the Alliance of Women in Psychology was that we wanted it to be, or it was formed of people who were affected by psychology, women who were affected by psychology. It wasn't an academic organization, and it wasn't only composed of people in academic positions. And this is really important for that history, I think. And we wanted it to be part of, I mean, there were other kind of movements going on about sort of service user, sort of radical psychology things happening that did continue to happen as well in various iterations. But eventually, the Alliance of Women in Psychology, sort of people in it, and that by this stage, after a while, it would include people like Sue Wilkinson and others, that the decision was taken that it would be worth, I mean, but it was a hard decision and thought about a lot. It would be worth going for institutional recognition within the BPS to form a section.
Right.
And so POWES grew out of that other wider network that included people who were in other, you know, working in other disciplines or feminists, and also maybe, you know, were receivers of psychological services who had quite a bit to say about things. The other thing that was important is that in both AWP and POWES, in the early days, there were a lot of practitioner psychologists, you could say, a lot of educational and clinical psychologists who were really, really committed and very active in the sort of making the, you know, in formulating what and strategy and what should happen. And it is, you know, a very saddening thing to see how part of the dynamic of POWES is that it became more and more difficult for those educational and clinical people to actively participate because of the demands of their work. And we saw this, we had a gendered analysis of this in terms of mental and manual labor and whose work gets valued. But it was always the case that even graduate students, let alone, you know, staff in academic, you know, in universities, were able to, you know, find the time or be supported to have the time to do the work and committees and whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, in Feminist and Psychological Practice, this book I had, as well as, I think I've got chapters in clinical psychology, but there was a chapter by some educational psychologists, and in the end, it was a very interesting chapter, but they pulled it at the last minute because they were worried about, even though it was going to be anonymous, they were worried about being identifiable in naming various things that were, that they had wanted to criticize. So that was quite dramatic and very difficult, but quite indicative, I think. POWES kind of grew out of a wider network of feminist activism, you could say.
Yeah.
And then it became increasingly difficult, and then all the, well-known issues around compromises around the name, etc. For a while, the conferences were joint between the Alliance of Women in Psychology and the Psychology of Women section, so that it would be possible to invite a broader range of people and support them to come.
Right.
And it is within my memory that it's not that long, not a tremendously long time ago, that Jan and I stopped being signatories on a Alliance of Women in Psychology checkbook.
Oh gosh.
But it had been moribund for a long time, really, because all the work, the effort of setting up the section basically sucked all the energy out of the Alliance of Women in Psychology. I mean,
Right.
it's a kind of, you could predict it as a sort of what would happen as an institutionalization, a casualty really of getting that kind of accreditation. And I still think that the Alliance of Women's, I mean, there's a role, we are desperately in need of arenas where both providers and users of services, kind of especially feminist ones, talk to each other.
Yes.
And feminists in psychology and feminists, even academics and academics in other disciplines talk to each other. There were tremendously fruitful discussions, and that became, gradually closed down. I suppose in that process. So I was involved in, I wouldn't say that, maybe not the very, very, very beginning, but quite early on.
Yeah.
And then I was there in the first few conferences. I think I've sent you the poster from the founding conference, or it's in the archive.
Yes. Yes.
Spender. It was wonderful. And some of those people whose name, like Poddy Pearman, I think she was very active in the Alliance of Women in Psychology, and other people who, and we hadn't, it was a struggle, and it felt like it was valuable, sort of doing this kind of feminist interventions. And really, we had no idea, I had no idea anyway, that it would ever get seen as a good thing by the, or that I would benefit, because most of us had actually, if you like, been disadvantaged by that kind of level of, by political engagement in these questions, rather, and it's a whole other scene now to be advantaged or support, but there's been such a radical transformation in and it's a great success story, both sort of both for the discipline, for POWES, for those of us who have benefited hugely, actually, but much to speaking for myself, much to my surprise. Yeah.
And so what year was that, did you say, sorry, that with the beginning of the AWP you were?
Well, I think was it 19, if I can just look at the poster out there for a moment.
Yes, that's fine.
Which is just, I'll be back in a moment. Ah. Oh. Well, as ever, there's no year on it.
Typical.
Typical. There's everything else, the time, the date, the organizers,
Yeah.
Burns, Matt de Jong, who I think went back to the Netherlands. I think it was 1985.
Okay.
I think it was. But that's easily the first conference, and with Dale Spender, Maria Tolley, feminist singer-songwriter. Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
So that was the first few conferences were joint. Sorry, what was your question again? The year?
Yeah, just the year. So around then. Yeah, and so you think really a benefit that POWES became an official kind of I suppose organization within the BPS?
Well, I think it's very difficult to say, because we knew, some of us, we were just very clear that there were going to be costs as well as benefits.
Yeah.
To go for institutional recognition, and you become part of that institution. I think, and psychology is a very elitist and exclusionary sort of profession, isn't it?
Yes.
I felt very committed to trying to maintain those outward facing links. Even when I became chair of POWES, I was sort of persuaded into it at one point, to sort of try and open up the channels both between academic and professional psychologists and other disciplines and other organizations. But we knew, I knew that this would probably happen, that it would become more and more sort of rarefied, running the risks then of de-radicalization and incorporation, recuperation, etc. And in order to function to fill in the application forms, to get the money, whatever, it of course it involves some compromises. But we had very explicit discussions about those risks, but also the costs of the desire for recognition or acknowledgement, or to create a space for feminists and feminisms in psychology to change psychology had to happen from within, I think, as well as it wouldn't have happened only from without.
Yes.
And I think the challenge now is to maintain the relations between inside and outside.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's great.
Yeah.
So you mentioned there being chair of POWES. What was that like for that period?
It was well, I haven't played a huge, since the early days of helping form the section a little bit. I wasn't a major player, I have to say, because I was more interested really, or committed politically, to Alliance Women's Psychology. But I did play a bit, and I went to conferences. So I kind of came in to it because I was persuaded by Rose, I think. I found, it was extraordinary to see what POWES has become, and feel, I don't know what my particular contribution was. I tried to support links out between psychology and other disciplines, and psychology, and I think I tried to make sure we didn't only have events down in London or in Cumberland Lodge, because beautiful is amazing and cost effective as Cumberland Lodge is. It's not everyone's cup of tea, so to speak, and it's a sort of colonial kind of class image, even though that's one of the great attractions as well, I think. That experience. I mean, I think I got caught up in an earlier moment when I was giving a keynote at POWES about the history in quite a lot of sort of quite vicious sort of dispute around who kind of owns the history, and I thought at the time I was just saying some very obvious things about how you know, the people who tell the stories tend to be the the history's winners, and there are always other stories, and that got, I don't know, that got hurt, it got misinterpreted, or people felt left out, or and as a result, kind of people witnessing, other participants of POWES witnessing that, I think there was a big commitment to sort of try and make POWES, and partly also, this is a separate issue and it was earlier, but the division between POWES and what was called POWES, the psychology of lesbian section,
Right.
which has become the sexuality section, which I'm also a member of. That and that some of that I think got unnecessarily difficult. There then became a great commitment to make the POWES conference a really supportive, inclusive place.
Yes.
And I think that was a lot of work went into that, and I don't think that was done without me. I was sort of not being active in POWES particularly at that point. But I think that was a great achievement. I mean, I would say now that I think we do need to have some debates, and they won't always be comfortable. And coming now as an sort of in an education department where there's all this discussion about pedagogies of discomfort and so on, particularly around sort of ways of challenging I suppose the colonialism and other forms of exclusionary elitism that inevitably POWES now must reproduce. It's going to be we can't but do that, and the question is what else we try and do. So the experience, I mean, it was I've had a very supportive committee, and I found it a bit odd to be in such a sort of mainstream position, and I don't think of myself as a leader particularly, but I did think that we had a good team, and I hope that some of the initiatives or ideas that I tried to bring kind of remain percolating through. And I think in terms of my own sort of academic trajectory as a someone who isn't the whole thing about feminist psychology being seen as part of social psychology, just being someone who wasn't a social psychologist. I never studied social psychology. I think that's important, a little bit important, to have a broader perspective on psychology and not be siphoned and ghettoized into one little area. But the POWES conferences have been sort of very wide, very wide ranging now, aren't they? And very creative and interesting.
Yes, hopefully.
Yeah.
And I wonder kind of, so I suppose you've seen POWES develop, particularly maybe in that sense of kind of trying to be more supportive, and do you think it's developed in any other particular ways, or do you think it should be developing?
Well, I think there's people like Rose and Sue and others who got into all the BPS committees. I mean, the whole thing about getting feminist psychology on the curriculum, or legitimate it, I mean, and qualitative and work and discourse work, I mean, it's always going to be a struggle. It's an ongoing it's an ongoing project, because it's going to be, the dynamics of the institution will always, the discipline will always be to try and erase that.
Yes.
So there have been huge institutional achievements, as well as and those are the good things about being recognized as being part of the discipline, as well as all the challenges of sort of how do you resist that just incorporation and the individualization processes that, or getting recruited into a liberal sort of apparatus of accreditation that forgets the broader systems of inequality that psychology as a discipline is very much a part of. I mean, it's not uniquely responsible for it, but it's a really key one in what stops. I mean, there's a radical psychology that I hope we could envisage what psychology must be part of emancipatory theories and practices. We need some theory of subjectivity and change along with everything else. But we have to keep being part of those kinds of discussions in social theory, feminist, queer, post-colonial, whatever. And not only work in psychology, I think, as feminists, psychologists, anti-psychologists.
Yeah. Yeah, so more like interdisciplinary stuff and outside of psychology as well.
Yeah.
Okay, lovely.
Outside, not only university work as well,
Yes, yeah, of course. Yeah.
I mean, it was very interesting doing these projects on domestic violence and minoritization. I mean, the fact that I was a university professor, I was a full professor by that point, was I wouldn't say that was an advantage. The fact that I could claim to be a mental health practitioner, I'd had a training, and I, so talking with social workers or refuge workers, domestic violence refuge workers or whatever, that at least I had some other kind of hat that sort of mitigated the elitism of the sort of university positioning.
Yes, that's really useful. Good point. Yeah, and I suppose I'm just wondering, that kind of difficult conference where you were doing your keynote, how did that kind of impact your engagement with POWES kind of after that, if at all?
Well, it was completely unexpected, and I felt quite hurt, and I think I was still part of the feminism psychology editorial board, and I was sort of had my knuckles wrapped as well,
Right.
I sort of I think I can't, I mean, I don't think I went off in a huff. I was sort of deeply but I suppose the thing is that other people were probably more shocked than me. I mean, I didn't talk about it or draft the paper lightly. So I had thought a lot about it, and I thought I'd written it as diplomatically and in a way to not individualize or personalize as much as possible. But I suppose what it showed me is that people will take things personally. Even though I really didn't intend that, and I did want to comment on institutional dynamics that we all participate in, but if people don't share that framework we're all participating, then they will take it personally, I suppose. And I don't think I sort of went off in a huff and thought I won't have anything to do with POWES, because other people were sort of, I mean, I don't think I would have done anyway, but other people were sort of really doing something with this, what was happening. And perhaps it opened things up quite fruitfully, really. I don't know. And so it's just, I suppose I was probably getting involved in lots of other things at the time too.
Yeah, no, that's great. Okay, perfect. Sorry, I am aware that we've kind of run over time. Are you still okay to...
I'm okay, but I don't want, I don't know about you.
Yeah, well, I don't want to keep you talking too long. Yeah. All right then. So I suppose we'll change gears a little bit to talk about feminism and psychology more broadly. So what impact do you think feminists have had in the field so far, and what do you think there's still to be done?
Oh well, I don't think I've got a lot to say on this question, really. I mean, I think we've I mean, it's hard to say, isn't it? Because in a way, lots of things don't call themselves feminist anymore, that, you know, probably are informed by or engaged with, and so it's harder to point to something and name it as feminist. And you know, that's because of the sort of the sort of recognition of the need to be more than feminist. You know, it's not a single well, if it were understood as a singular sort of positioning, then it would be very unhelpful and exclusionary. So I think that you know, psychology is a very different discipline now than it was when I started studying it. So there's been huge impact and awareness. There's been a lot of social change generally. So I don't think, you know, feminist activists in an outside psychology can really lay claim to being responsible for all of that. And I mean, I think the lesson there is that we are, you know, we might think that we're, you know, making a lot of changes, but actually we're just, you know, responding to or riding the wave of things that happen elsewhere. But you know, psychology is a much more receptive discipline for feminist ideas than it used to be. I don't underestimate the level of resistance and the various forms of backlash, and there's certainly loads around, and there's loads of political challenges generally. Look at what's happening with abortion, etc. And so so it, you know, it will never be a completed project until, well, and the history will always be at risk of being erased, which is why it's good you're doing this. And it's but I feel that I've, you know, I've participated in quite a small way, but lots of people have sort of got much more involved than me in sort of both changing the nuts and bolts of its organization, like the BPS and its equivalent in other countries. I mean, I'm just not someone who can bear to do a lot of that. And you know, I'd rather be sort of formulating the arguments for not doing so, and keeping them alive too in a friendly way. And I hope that, you know, that one needs those dialogues in and outside, you know, and between institutions. Yeah. So that was a question about, well, how successful is, I mean, I think that, yeah, there have been dramatic changes, but it's hard to know what we could measure it against. So
yes, I suppose that's true. Yeah. Yes, well, hopefully yeah, still some more changes to go.
Well, yes, I mean, the work is not, it will never be done, will it? And you know, you know, now I work on the counseling psychology program, and you know, that whole thing about, you know, sort of, where are the men? We need men, you know, etc. And that whole thing about women studying psychology, and you know, that I remember from decades ago, oh, we need more male undergraduates, blah blah, you know. So it gets you know, the same, a lot of the things are the same as well as different, aren't they?
Yes, yeah, that's very true, actually. Yeah, some good changes, but still some of the kind of same narratives, I suppose, happening.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So lastly then, what advice could you give to feminists or activists entering psychology now?
Oh, gosh, that's really hard. Well, this is not a comment about POWES, but more about my sort of academic, my professional experience more generally. Don't put your faith in institutions. Don't identify with institutions. or don't only identify with institutions. Institutions aren't loyal. It's the people in them that are or aren't. So I think it's about building networks, alliances, that, you know, I hope that, you know, if feminists who are already feminist identified coming into psychology, they need to, you know, stay feminist, and to do that they can't only be feminist in psychology. That psychology is not a is you know, it's possible now to be a feminist psychologist, but that should always be, given the sort of levels of, you know, oppression and inequality around, and the elitism of the institution, a very tense position of navigating the feminist identifications and activisms outside the discipline, and you know, I really respect some colleagues, doubtless people you've interviewed for this project, who put huge amounts of energy into making the discipline and making the British Psychological Society and other sort of national psychology organizations much better places and doing much better work. And I'm so grateful that they did that, because I know that I wouldn't have been able to stomach it for so long. You know, I did my time going to some of those committees, and I supported a lot of initiatives. But really, I think my preferences and my strengths lie in trying to keep the communication and the links open, to sort of keep us a bit on our toes, and that's not always comfortable, as I said, and accountable to feminists outside psychology, you know, where feminist identified people who would probably do lots of other things as well.
Yeah.
And we shouldn't put all our eggs in the institution's basket. That's a way to, it's a recipe for complete depoliticization and incorporation, as well. I'm sure, you know, everybody knows that. There are times when maybe you have to do it, but for a bit. But don't forget that we in feminist and psychology are benefiting from the activism from outside.
Yes, absolutely. That's lovely point. That's great. Okay, perfect. So is there anything else that I haven't mentioned that you'd particularly like to cover, either about yourself or about feminist psychology?
I'll probably think of loads of things when we stop, of course, but that's, you know, that's the what happens at the end of the recording.
Yeah.
Experience, isn't it? I think we've covered quite a lot. I mean, is there anything that you want to sort of follow up from my rambles around?
Yeah, I suppose the only thing that I was thinking of maybe heading back to was kind of that idea around maybe your disenchantment at the end of your undergrad, and sort of then starting to go into the critical stuff, and kind of how did that happen?
How did that happen? Yeah. Well, I think I found other people to talk to who could give me ways of thinking and a language for what seemed like sort of strange and stupid things. I mean, I discovered I didn't like statistics very much during my undergraduate course, and we didn't actually have to pass an exam in statistics. And my undergraduate project had a chi-squared in it.
Very exciting.
Yeah, but I think it kind of so I think by the time I finished the undergraduate degree, I was still a sort of pretty signed up developmental psychologist and cognitive scientist, and through the cognitive studies, actually I didn't really get on with programming that much, but the philosophy of mind was very helpful, and we had courses in epistemology in the first year. So those were really, really important and remain really important for me. as as exercises in critical thinking, and all the debates about mind-body dualisms and everything. It was all part of what we were dealing with, studying and thinking about the human computer metaphor and interaction, etc. And the developmental psychology was very much engaged with that. So I mean, I think a lot of it is very interesting, but I remained very, I came out of that degree very skeptical about what computers can do, actually. Yes. A very healthy suspicion really about them. But I think, then I moved to Manchester, and I lived in a collective house with other feminists, and I got involved as a feminist in various campaigns, and green and women's groups and all the rest of it. So I think I realized I needed to educate myself about things that I'd sort of buried myself in the books, and so it was a kind of a much more dawning realization. So really the politicization happened during my doctoral years, although I had these, retrospectively, these experiences as an undergraduate and obviously child, etc., growing up. And I became involved in Manchester in lots of other groups. There were sort of immigration and deportation campaigns. I got involved in a publishing collective that was principally inspired by a debate in Spare Rib that excluded Jewish women from speaking out about their position when they felt categorized and were silenced if around the presumed alignment with being Zionist, and lots and lots of sort of those kinds of political things, which are, Nira Yuval Davis actually has written quite a lot about. Lots of people have sort of now reflected on that period of time. I actually published a book before I became it was a book called That's Funny, You Don't Look Anti-Semitic, an anti-racist analysis of left anti-Semitism, with a dear friend who was a lesbian feminist activist, and taught me a lot, actually, and an immigration lawyer, Steve Cohen. And the demand for publishing this pamphlet, it really was a pamphlet, came from Jewish feminists who felt this analysis was going to be useful in countering the anti-Semitism in the name of anti-Zionism that was circulating in the women's movement. Now, I want to say very clearly that I think that debate happened then, and I hold to the positions I took then, but that's very different from what's happening now in the kind of weaponization of accusations of anti-Semitism, right, and the way in which that is used to close down criticism of the state of Israel. And this is something that feminists and Jewish feminists and socialists have played a big role in debating.
Yes.
Right now, remains very salient. Yes. And so I became involved in, I suppose, some anti-imperialist struggles more generally, and met people and talked with them, and I think that helped. Yes. The sort of and of course, all the how people react to you when you say you study psychology, etc. You have to think and take those reactions seriously, what's going on and what that says, so I think it's I can't name a sort of light bulb moment kind of thing. It's much more gradual as a postgrad student, as I sort of grew up a bit, and and understood that I needed these analyses to help me understand myself, and to be with other people.
Yes.
And so it became very, very important. from not being very important at all.
And I suppose just very quickly, you talk about kind of being an anti-psychologist, and I'm just wondering that how that feels for you, I suppose, within the kind of mainstream. What is that experience like within kind of the institution and mainstream psychology?
Well, I suppose I'm now in a privileged position, you know, as a senior academic, you know, that people sort of, you know, well, this is the Marcuse's term, something about repressive tolerance or something. They kind of sometimes like it a bit, sometimes don't. I mean, I think because I work at the intersection of psychology, gender studies or sexual or whatever, and childhood studies, you know, there's a way of playing off those different positions. I mean, I suppose I'm a, you know, constitutionally marginal now, aren't I? In, you know, or in, I'm suspicious of in general, and I'm suspicious of having the idea of having a unique place of belonging. I think it's potentially dangerous and very exclusionary. So, I mean, I've learned to sort of, most of the time, I mean, there have been times when I feel pretty pissed off at being left out, marginalized, whatever. But
yeah,
but mostly I enjoy the being in multiple positions and having lots of different perspectives. And you know, I didn't expect ever, you know, this is one of the differences with young people, you know, who've kind of approached me and, you know, other senior academics saying, how, you know, how did you get to where you're going, where you are now, and I want to do that kind of thing. You know, I didn't expect to do a PhD. I certainly had no idea I was going to get a job in a university, let alone an elite one. And be a senior academic. I mean, so I know this sounds very much like the sort of the luck versus hard work, gendered sort of locus of control stuff. But you know, I do think that if you know, I might have a very different story to tell if I had said I really want to be a professor, etc. I don't have that sense of entitlement about it. I can't even bring myself to, we don't get some increments or whatever. I can't even bring myself to apply for them. And because I just think, well, you know,
no, that's so
no, that's too much of an, you know, you have every application you write. I mean, I'm in a very privileged position now. I'm not under huge amounts of pressure to income generate, which, so, you know, which, and I've only ever published the stuff I wanted to publish. So yeah, for my advice to feminists and academics, or, you know, in psychology, don't do any research that isn't meaningful to you just because you think that it'll get you somewhere. You know, that's why I said I think it was in a way a favor, although I felt, you know, a bit looked down upon, but working in a mere polytechnic, and there were, you know, it was very low status as a you know, in higher education. I didn't have that pressure. Didn't have the pressure to write particular things, you know, and because I was research active, I you know, it was such an amazing thing. They didn't really care what it was. And because we put Manchester Poly on the map a bit, you know, that was a good thing. We, you know, so paradoxically being marginal got some sort of benefits or attention, and because I didn't do anything I really didn't want to. I mean, you know, in the end I did go for a European Social Fund grant, and there is I'm sitting in this room now, and I've got a window here, and I remember looking out of the window at the and it was sort of the deadline for the grant was coming out, and Khadija Chandler and I were just working so hard on this grant, and I opened the curtains and I saw the tree was in bud, and instead of saying bigger buds, I said bugger bids. And you know, at home we talk about this a lot. You know, that was a real sign. Never again, never another grant. And it would be impossible to get that now because they've changed anyway, Brexit and everything. Not allowed to. So, but you know, that was a valuable piece of work. You know, but I would just say, don't stop being feminist when you become a psychologist. Yeah,
that's lovely. Thank you. Okay, so just for the record, then, could you state your place and date of birth, please?
My place.
Yes, date and place. Yeah.
Oh, of birth.
Yes.
Yeah, I was born in Liverpool on the 4th of July, 1960. Yeah.
Lovely. And your gender?
Well, the birth certificate says I'm a girl, and because I have seen it actually. Yeah, so I do identify as a woman, cisgendered. Yeah.
And your occupation?
So I work in the Institute of. I'm professor of education. So when I left MMU, I had psychology and women's studies as my title, you know, and then when I got the job, for lots of reasons, I just thought I'll take a general title, Professor of Education in the University, Manchester Institute of Education, University of Manchester. That's where I am at the moment.
Perfect.
Yeah.